The Crimson Crown of Valdris, Ancient Legends script. Listen closely, for what I am about to tell you happened in an age when the world was young and God still walked among mortals. When magic flowed through the earth, like blood through veins, and when a single decision could reshape the destiny of nations. This is the tale of the Crimson Crown of Valdris, an artifact so powerful that wars were fought merely for the right to gaze upon it, and so cursed that every soul who wore it was doomed to a fate worse than death. Some say this story is myth, a fabrication born from the fevered imagination of ancient storytellers. Others claim it is allegory, a moral lesson wrapped in the garments of fantasy. But I know the truth because I have walked the buried halls of Valdris. I have touched the stones that once supported that mighty kingdom, and I have seen with my own eyes the proof that legends are sometimes more real than the world we think we know. The tale begins 3,000 years ago, in the golden age of the Valdrian Empire, when their armies had conquered half the known world and their cities gleamed like jewels beneath the sun. At the heart of this vast empire stood the capital city of Valdris Major, a metropolis so magnificent that travelers would weep at their first sight of its ivory towers and crystal bridges. And at the center of Valdris Major, rising like a mountain of carved stone and precious metals, stood the Palace of Eternal Seasons, where dwelt Empress Seraphina, the magnificent, ruler of 20 kingdoms, and commander of 1,000,000 souls. Seraphina was not born to rule, the third daughter of a minor noble family from the frontier. She had risen to power through a combination of brilliant military strategy, ruthless political maneuvering, and what her enemies whispered was the darkest of sorceries. By the age of 30, she had united the warring city-states of the eastern continent under a single banner. By 35, she had crossed the great ocean and claimed the western lands for her empire. By 40, she commanded territory that stretched from the frozen peaks of the northern mountains to the burning deserts of the south. But for all her conquests and achievements, Seraphina harbored a secret fear that gnawed at her like a cancer. She was mortal, and mortality meant that everything she had built would eventually crumble to dust. Her empire was held together by her personal charisma and the terror her name inspired in her enemies. When she died, the carefully balanced alliances and treaties that maintained peace across her vast domain would collapse, and the empire would tear itself apart in civil war. It was this fear that led her to seek out the Crimson Crown of Valdris, a legendary artifact that was said to grant its wearer dominion over death itself. According to the ancient texts, the crown had been forged in the earliest days of the world by the god of time and fate. It was made from metal that had fallen from the stars, inlaid with gems that held captured fragments of divine essence, and imbued with power that could make its wearer immortal and invincible. But the crown came with a price that the legends spoke of only in whispers. Every previous owner had eventually suffered a transformation, left them something less than human and something more than monster. The first king to wear it had ruled for 1,000 years. Before, his subjects discovered that he had been feeding on the life force of his own people to maintain his immortality. The second had become so paranoid and cruel that his own family had finally conspired to destroy him, though they had died in the attempt. The third had simply vanished one day, leaving behind only a throne room filled with the withered corpses of his entire court. Despite these warnings, Seraphina was determined to claim the crown for herself. She believed that her iron will and superior intellect would allow her to master the artifact's power without succumbing to its corruption. More importantly, she believed that the alternative, watching her empire collapse into chaos after her death, was a fate worse than any curse the crown might bring. The quest for the crown began with years of research. Seraphina gathered scholars and sages from across her empire, tasking them with scouring every ancient text, every fragment of old prophecy, every whispered legend for clues about the crown's location. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The Crimson Crown had last been seen 500 years earlier, in the possession of the Witch King, who had used its power to rule the northern kingdoms with absolute authority. But Malachor had made a fatal error. He had grown arrogant and declared himself superior to the gods themselves. In response, the divine powers had sent a hero named Theron, the Pure, to challenge the Witch King's rule. The battle between Theron and Malachor had lasted 7 days and 7 nights, devastating the landscape for hundreds of miles around. In the end, Theron had managed to defeat the Witch King not through superior strength or skill, but through a clever stratagem that turned the crown's own power against its wielder. As Malachor lay dying, he had pronounced a curse upon both the crown and anyone who might seek to claim it in the future. "Let the crown be hidden where only the truly desperate will dare to seek it," he had whispered with his final breath. Let it rest in a place where the living fear to tread, guarded by horrors that make death seem like mercy. And let all who claim it discover that immortality is not a gift, but the cruelest of punishments. Following Malaka's death, Theron had hidden the crown in the Necropolis of Shadows, a vast underground city of the dead that lay beneath the ruins of the Witch King's former capital. The necropolis was said to be inhabited by the spirits of all those who had died under Malakor's rule, as well as creatures so terrible that even the gods hesitated to name them. For most rulers, such a location would have been deterrent enough to abandon the quest entirely. But Seraphina was not most rulers. She began planning an expedition to the Necropolis of Shadows with the same methodical precision she had once applied to conquering continents. First, she assembled a team of experts unlike any the world had ever seen. There was Marcus the Bold, the greatest warrior of his generation, whose sword had never tasted defeat, and whose courage was legendary even among the fearless soldiers of the Imperial army. There was Lydia the Wise, an ancient sorceress whose knowledge of magic was exceeded only by her understanding of the supernatural forces that governed life and death. There was Kale a master thief and assassin who could move unseen through any environment, and whose skills at bypassing traps and locks were unmatched. But perhaps most importantly, there was Father Benedict, a priest of the old faith whose devotion to the divine powers was so complete that he could channel their protective energy even in the darkest of places. Benedict had initially refused to join the expedition, arguing that seeking the crown was an act of hubris that would bring only disaster. But Seraphina had eventually convinced him, by arguing that the crown's power could be used to bring peace and prosperity to the Empire's millions of citizens. The expedition set out on the first day of spring, when the ice had begun to melt in the northern passes, but the roads were still firm, enough to support their heavily loaded wagons. In addition to the core team of specialists, Seraphina had brought along 50 of her most elite guards, a dozen scholars and enough supplies to sustain the entire group for several months. The journey to the ruins of Malaka's former capital took 6 weeks, leading them through increasingly desolate terrain as they traveled northward. The closer they came to their destination, the more obvious it became that the land itself had been poisoned by the Witch King's dark magic. Trees grew in twisted, unnatural shapes, their leaves black as coal, and their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Rivers ran dark with water that tasted of metal and despair. Even the animals seemed wrong somehow. Wolves with too many eyes, birds whose songs sounded like human screams, deer whose antlers grew in spirals that hurt to look at directly. But it was the silence that was most disturbing. As they approached the ruins, the normal sounds of the wilderness gradually faded away until they were traveling through a landscape where nothing stirred except their own footsteps and the creaking of their wagon wheels. It was as if the very air had grown thick with an oppressive presence that discouraged all forms of life. The ruins of Malakar's capital, once called stretched across a valley that had been beautiful before the Witch King's corruption had taken hold. Now it was a maze of broken stone and twisted metal, where buildings had melted and reformed into impossible shapes under the influence of uncontrolled magical forces. At the center of the ruins stood the remains of Malaka's palace, a structure so warped by dark energy that it seemed to shift and change whenever observed directly. But their destination lay beneath the palace, in the Necropolis of Shadows that had been carved into the living rock over the course of centuries. The entrance was a great archway that had been sealed with both physical barriers and powerful magical wards, designed to keep the horrors within from escaping into the world above. Breaking through these barriers took 3 days of concentrated effort from Lydia and her magical implements. As each ward was dissolved and each seal was broken, the expedition members could feel the oppressive atmosphere growing stronger, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Strange sounds began to echo from the depths below, whispers and languages that predated human civilization. The scraping of claws against stone, and something that might have been weeping or might have been laughter. When the last barrier finally fell, a wave of cold, stale air rushed out of the opening, carrying with it the smell of ancient death, and something else that made their stomachs churn with instinctive revulsion. But Seraphina stood firm at the entrance, her imperial robes snapping in the unnatural wind, and spoke the words that would define the rest of her life. "We have come too far to turn back now," she declared. "Whatever lies below, we shall face it with courage and emerge victorious. The crown awaits, and with it, the power to secure our empire's future for all eternity." The descent into the Necropolis of Shadows began at dawn on the 4th day. The entrance tunnel was wide enough for people to walk abreast, its walls lined with carvings that depicted scenes of death and resurrection in disturbing detail. As they moved deeper underground, the carvings became more elaborate and more unsettling, showing figures that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light of their torches. The first chamber they entered was vast beyond comprehension, its ceiling lost in darkness high above their heads. The floor was covered with thousands of stone sarcophagi arranged in perfect rows that stretched away into the distance. Each sarcophagus was carved with a likeness of its occupant, and as the expedition members walked among them, they realized that every face showed the same expression of absolute terror, as if each person had died in the grip of unimaginable fear. But the sarcophagi were not the chamber's most disturbing feature. That distinction belonged to the shadows themselves, which moved independently of any light source and seemed to reach out toward the living, with an almost palpable hunger. Father Benedict muttered prayers under his breath as they passed, his holy symbol glowing with a faint white light that pushed back the grasping darkness. As they progressed deeper into the necropolis, the expedition encountered their first Guardiana creature that had once been human, but had been transformed by centuries of exposure to the crown-esque corrupting. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body stretched and distorted until it resembled a grotesque parody of human form. Its skin was pale as parchment and covered with writhing black veins that pulsed with unnatural life, while its eyes burned with a cold fire that seemed to see straight through to their souls. The creature spoke in a voice like grinding stone, welcoming them to its domain and asking if they had come to join the eternal vigil. When Marcus stepped forward with his sword drawn, the creature laughed a sound like breaking glass that echoed through the chamber for what seemed like hours. The battle that followed was unlike anything the expedition members had ever experienced. The creature moved with impossible speed and strength, its claws capable of carving through solid stone as if it were soft clay. But more disturbing than its physical abilities was its apparent immunity to conventional weapons. Marcus's blade, which had cut through enemy armor as if it was silk, barely scratched the creature's hide. It was only when Father Benedict began chanting one of the most powerful banishment rituals that the creature showed any sign of vulnerability. The holy words seemed to cause it physical pain, and as the priest's voice rose in volume and intensity, the creature began to shriek and writhe as if being burned by invisible flames. But even as it was weakened by the divine power, the creature managed to speak one final warning. "You seek the crown that destroys all who touch it. Turn back now, while you still remember what it means to be human." The shadows ahead hold horrors that make me seem like a gentle lamb, and the crown itself, the creature's voice, dissolved into a sound like wind through dead leaves. As Father Benedict's ritual finally took effect, banishing it back to whatever dimension had spawned it, the encounter left the entire expedition shaken, but Seraphina pressed on with grim determination. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now, regardless of the dangers that lay ahead. The second level of the necropolis was different from the first. Instead of orderly rows of sarcophagi, it was a maze of narrow corridors and small chambers, each one containing artifacts and treasures that had belonged to the Witch King's victims. But touching any of these objects proved to be deadly, as several members of the expedition discovered when they were instantly aged to dust by cursed jewelry or transformed into stone statues by enchanted weapons. It was in this section that they encountered the whispering shadow entities that existed at the boundary between life and death, capable of showing visions of possible futures to anyone who looked into their depths. The shadows showed Seraphina glimpses of what her empire would become if she claimed the crown. Cities of marble and gold where her subjects lived in perfect harmony. Armies that conquered not through violence, but through the sheer majesty of her presence, and herself as an ageless goddess queen whose wisdom and power brought prosperity to all who served her. But the shadows also showed her darker visions, herself as a withered creature feeding on the life force of her own people. Her empire transformed into a realm of the undead where the living existed only to serve her hunger and her own consciousness, gradually dissolving into madness as the centuries passed without end. "Which future will come to pass?" she asked the shadows, but they only laughed and replied, "That depends on what you choose to believe about yourself, Empress. The crown grants power, but it is the wielder's nature that determines how that power is used." The third level of the necropolis was the most dangerous yet. Here, the very architecture seemed to be alive, with walls that shifted and moved to trap unwary travelers, and floors that opened into bottomless pits without warning. The air itself was toxic, requiring the expedition members to breathe through cloth filters soaked in holy water, just to avoid being poisoned by the atmosphere. It was here that they lost their first team member, Kale the Shadow Walker, despite all his skill at avoiding traps, stepped on a stone that triggered a mechanism so ancient and complex that even Lydia's magical senses could not detect it in time. The floor beneath his feet crumbled away, and he fell into a shaft that seemed to have no bottom. His screams echoed from the depths for several minutes before finally fading into silence, but even as they mourned their fallen comrade, the expedition pressed on. They had come too far to turn back, and the crown was now so close that they could sometimes hear it calling to them a sound like distant music that grew stronger as they descended deeper into the earth. The fourth level was where they encountered the crown's guardian, a being so terrible that merely looking at it directly caused two of the remaining guards to flee in screaming terror. The guardian had once been there on the Pure, the hero who had defeated the Witch King Malika 5 centuries earlier, but exposure to the crown's power had transformed him into something that was neither alive nor dead, neither human nor monster. His body was translucent, like crystal or ice, and through his skin they could see a network of golden veins that pulsed with the same rhythm as a heartbeat. His eyes were pools of liquid starlight that seemed to contain the knowledge of ages, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that resonated in their bones. "I have been waiting for you, Seraphina, of Valdris," he said, his words echoing strangely in the chamber. "I knew that someone would eventually come seeking the crown, driven by the same pride and ambition that once consumed I have spent 500 years in this place, watching over the crown and trying to understand the nature of the curse that binds me to it." Seraphina stepped forward, her own voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. "Stand aside. Hero, I have not come this far to be turned away by a ghost from the past." Theron laughed, and the sound was like silver bells mixed with winter wind. "A ghost, perhaps, but I am a ghost with purpose, and that purpose is to ensure that the crown never again sees the light of day. Do you know what it cost me to hide it here? Do you understand what I sacrificed to keep its power from corrupting the world?" He gestured to his transformed body, and as he did so, they could see the extent of his torment. The golden veins that ran through his flesh were not blood vessels but conduits for the crown's power, keeping him eternally alive but also eternally in pain. He was trapped between life and death, unable to find peace, but also unable to truly die. "This is what the crown does to those who seek to control it," he continued. "It grants great power, yes, but it also ensures that its wielders become something other than human. Malaka believed he could master it through strength and cruelty. I believed I could contain it through righteousness and sacrifice. We were both wrong." Seraphina listened to his warning, but her determination never wavered. "Perhaps you were both wrong because you approached the crown with the wrong mindset," she replied. "Malaka sought power for its own sake, and you sought to deny power entirely. But I seek power for a higher purpose to preserve and protect my empire and its people. That difference may be what allows me to succeed where you both failed." The battle between Seraphina's expedition and Theron, the Pure, was not a contest of physical strength or magical power. Instead, it was a battle of wills and philosophies, fought as much with words as with weapons. Theron tested each member of the expedition, probing their motivations and their resolve, trying to determine whether they were truly worthy of facing the crown's power. Marcus the Bold faced trials of courage, forced to confront his deepest fears and prove that his bravery was based on principle rather than mere recklessness. Lydia the Wise was tested on her knowledge and judgment, required to solve riddles that had no clear answers and make choices that had no right solutions. Father Benedict's faith was challenged by visions of divine abandonment and cosmic meaninglessness, forcing him to choose between despair and hope without any evidence to guide his decision. But it was Seraphina herself who faced the greatest test. Theron showed her visions of every possible future that might result from her claiming the crown thousands of different times, each one branching from her decision in the depths of the Necropolis. In some, she became a benevolent goddess queen who brought peace and prosperity to the world. In others, she became a tyrant whose cruelty made Malika look like a saint. In still others, she simply ceased to exist, consumed entirely by the crown's power. "Do you see?" Theron asked as the visions swirled around them. "There is no guarantee of any particular outcome. The crown amplifies whatever qualities already exist within its wielder, but it also changes those qualities in unpredictable ways. You may begin with noble intentions, but centuries of immortal rule will inevitably corrupt even the purest heart." Seraphina studied the visions carefully, seeing herself in 100 different forms and facing 1,000 different fates. But in the end, her answer was the same as it had been from the beginning. "I accept the risk. she said simply. My empire will face civil war and collapse without strong leadership to hold it together. Millions of innocent people will suffer and die if I do not act. Against that certainty, I am willing to gamble with uncertain futures. Theron stared at her for a long moment, his crystalline features unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. You speak with conviction, and your love for your people seems genuine, he admitted. Perhaps you will indeed prove different from those who came before. But know this, Empress, the crown will test you in ways you cannot imagine. It will offer you choices that have no right answers and force you to make decisions that will haunt you for eternity. Are you truly prepared for that burden? I am, Seraphina replied without hesitation. With those words, Theron stepped aside, allowing them to pass into the final chamber where the crimson crown of Valdris waited in its resting place. The crown chamber was surprisingly simple, after all the elaborate traps and guardians they had encountered. It was a small, circular room with walls of polished black stone that reflected their torchlight like dark mirrors. At the center of the room stood a pedestal of white marble, and upon that pedestal sat the crown itself. The crimson crown was both more and less impressive than the legends had suggested. It was undoubtedly beautiful, a circlet of metal that seemed to shift between gold and silver and copper as the light struck it from different angles, set with 9 gems that burned like captured stars. But it was also smaller and more delicate than expected, as if it had been crafted for someone with a more modest sense of their own importance. As Seraphina approached the pedestal, she could feel the crown's power calling to her. It was not the overwhelming force she had expected, but rather a gentle tugging sensation, like a friend beckoning her forward. The gems pulsed with a soft light that seemed to match the rhythm of her heartbeat, and she could swear she heard voices whispering words of encouragement and welcome. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as they approached the ancient artifact. The moment her skin made contact with the metal, she felt a surge of energy, unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if lightning had struck her, but instead of pain, there was only a sense of completeness and power that filled every cell of her body. The crown was surprisingly light as she lifted it from the pedestal, weighing no more than a simple circlet of gold despite the massive gems embedded in its surface. As she placed it upon her head, she felt her consciousness expand in ways that defied description. Suddenly, she could sense the thoughts and emotions of everyone in her empire, from the highest noble to the lowest peasant. She could see the threads of cause and effect that connected every decision to its consequences, stretching forward and backward through time like an infinite web. But with this expanded awareness came understanding of the crown's true nature. It was not merely a tool that granted power, it was a living entity in its own right, an intelligence that had been shaped by the personalities and desires of every previous wearer. She could feel their presence within the crown, their memories and knowledge becoming part of her own consciousness. From Malika she gained understanding of magic and the supernatural forces that governed reality. From the ancient kings who had worn the crown before him, she learned the arts of statecraft and the subtle ways that power could be exercised. From Theron, whose brief contact with the crown had left an imprint of his noble spirit, she inherited a sense of duty and sacrifice that would guide her decisions in the years to come. But she also inherited their flaws and their failures, their fears and their obsessions. The crown did not simply grant power, it preserved everything about its wearers, both good and evil, creating a composite consciousness that was greater than the sum of its parts, but also more complex and potentially dangerous. As the transformation took hold, Seraphina felt her body beginning to change. Her physical form became more resilient, capable of healing from wounds that would kill ordinary humans, and immune to diseases and poisons that might threaten mortal rulers. Her senses expanded beyond normal human limits, allowing her to see and hear things that existed beyond the normal spectrum of perception. But most importantly, she felt the barriers of mortality beginning to dissolve. Death, which had been the ultimate constraint on her ambitions, was no longer a concern. She would have all the time she needed to build her empire into something truly magnificent, to guide her people toward a golden age that would last for millennia. The return journey to Valdris Major took only 3 weeks, as the crown's power allowed Seraphina to travel by methods that transcended normal physical limitations. She could step through shadows and emerge hundreds of miles away, or simply will herself to be in a different location and find that reality had rearranged itself to accommodate her desire. When she arrived at her palace, she found that news of her transformation had somehow preceded her. Her courtiers and advisors looked upon her with a mixture of awe and terror, sensing the fundamental change that had taken place, even though they could not fully understand its nature. The crown was visible only to those she chose to show it to. appearing to most observers as nothing more than an elaborate headdress or ceremonial ornament. But those with magical sensitivity could perceive its true nature, and they spoke in whispers of the terrible power that now resided within their empress. Some began making preparations to flee the capital, fearing that Seraphina had doomed herself and her empire by claiming such a dangerous artifact. Others saw opportunity in her transformation, hoping to gain favor with a ruler who now possessed near-divine power. Seraphina herself spent the first months after her return learning to control her new abilities and integrating the knowledge she had inherited from previous crown bearers. She discovered that ruling with godlike power was far more complex than ruling as a mere mortal, as every decision now carried consequences that rippled across multiple dimensions of reality. The first major test of her transformed nature came when a coalition of neighboring kingdoms declared war against the Valdrian Empire, believing that Seraphine's mysterious journey had weakened her position and made her vulnerable to attack. They could not have been more wrong. The war lasted exactly 7 days. On the first day, Seraphina appeared simultaneously on a dozen different battlefields, her presence alone causing enemy armies to lay down their weapons in terror. On the second day, she demonstrated the crown's power over the elements by calling down lightning from clear skies and raising walls of stone from empty plains. By the third day, the coalition's leaders were begging for mercy, offering to surrender their kingdoms entirely rather than face any more displays of her supernatural abilities. But it was what happened on the seventh day that truly demonstrated how the crown had changed her. Instead of accepting the coalition's surrender and adding their territories to her empire, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She forgave their aggression and offered to form an alliance that would benefit all parties. This act of mercy was not what the previous crown bearers would have chosen. Malika would have destroyed the coalition utterly, making examples of their leaders to discourage future rebellions. The ancient kings would have demanded tribute and hostages to ensure future compliance. But Seraphina, guided by Theron's inherited sense of justice and her own genuine love for her people, chose a path that strengthened her empire without requiring the destruction of her enemies. The decades that followed were marked by unprecedented prosperity and growth. Under Seraphine's transformed leadership, the Valdrian Empire expanded not through conquest but through voluntary association, as other nations sought to join an alliance that offered protection and prosperity, demanding the sacrifice of their independence. Art and science flourished under her patronage, as the crown's power allowed her to perceive connections and possibilities that were invisible to ordinary minds. She commissioned great works of architecture that seemed to defy the laws of physics, supported scholars whose research advanced human knowledge by centuries, and fostered cultural exchanges that enriched the lives of millions. But as the years passed, Seraphina began to notice subtle changes in herself that concerned her. The crown's power was indeed preserving her life and maintaining her physical form, but it was also gradually altering her perspective on humanity and mortality. She found herself becoming less emotionally connected to the day-to-day concerns of her subjects, viewing their problems from an increasingly distant and analytical perspective. The people she had once known as individuals began to seem more like pieces on a vast game board, important for their roles in the larger pattern but not particularly significant as individual personality. This shift in perception was not malicious. She still cared about the welfare of her empire and worked tirelessly to improve the lives of her citizens. But the personal connections that had once motivated were gradually being replaced by a more abstract sense of duty and purpose. More troubling still were the dreams that began to plague her sleep. In these visions, she saw herself as she might become in centuries to come, a figure of terrible beauty and power who had lost all connection to her human origins. The crown showed her possible futures where she became a goddess worshipped by her descendants, a tyrant whose word was absolute law, or simply a force of nature that shaped the world according to incomprehensible patterns. But the most disturbing visions were those that showed her empire after she was gone. Despite the crown's promise of immortality, she could see that even her enhanced form would not last forever. Eventually, the power that preserved her would fade or be overcome by forces beyond her control. And when that happened, the carefully balanced civilization she had built would collapse into chaos. It was this realization that led her to make the most difficult decision of her transformed existence. If she could not be truly immortal, then she needed to find a way to preserve not just her empire, but the wisdom and knowledge she had accumulated through her connection to the crown. She needed to create a legacy that would outlast even her enhanced lifespan. The solution she devised was both brilliant and tragic. Using the crown's power over space and time, she began constructing what she called the Archive of Ages vast repository of knowledge and memory that would preserve everything important about her civilization for future generations. But this was not simply a library or museum. It was a living record that captured not just facts and information, but the actual experiences and consciousness of everyone who contributed to its creation. The process required her to gradually transfer portions of her own enhanced consciousness into the archive, along with the memories and knowledge of the crown's previous bearers. As she did so, she could feel herself becoming less human and more like a pure embodiment of information and experience. But she persevered, driven by her determination to ensure that the wisdom gained through centuries of rule would not be lost when her physical form finally failed. The construction of the archive took nearly a century to complete, during which time Seraphin's physical appearances became increasingly rare. She governed through intermediaries and magical projections, focusing most of her attention on the complex process of encoding human consciousness into forms that could survive the passage of millennia. When the archive was finally finished, Seraphina faced her final choice. She could maintain her current existence indefinitely, ruling as a dissident and increasingly inhuman goddess empress until some future catastrophe finally destroyed her, or she could complete the transfer of her consciousness into the archive, preserving everything important about herself and her civilization at the cost of her individual existence. In the end, the choice was easier than she had expected. She had spent so many years gradually becoming less human that the prospect of transcending physical existence entirely held no terror for her. On the night of the summer solstice, exactly 200 years after she had first claimed the Crimson Crown, Seraphina performed the final ritual that would transfer her consciousness completely into the Archive of Ages. The process was witnessed by her most trusted advisors and the high priests of the major temples, all of whom had been prepared for this moment through years of careful explanation. As the ritual reached its climax, Seraphina's physical form began to dissolve into points of light that were absorbed into the crystalline structures of the archive. The Crimson Crown, no longer having a wearer to sustain it, crumbled to dust that was scattered by winds that seemed to come from nowhere. But her voice continued to speak from the archive, now carrying harmonics that had never existed in mortal speech. "My physical reign has ended," she said, "but my duty continues. The archive will preserve our knowledge and wisdom for as long as civilization endures, and through it, I will guide future generations toward the light of truth and understanding." The Valdrian Empire continued to prosper for another 3 centuries, under the guidance of the archive, with Seraphin's consciousness serving as an advisor and teacher to her successors. But eventually, as she had foreseen, the empire began to decline as new challenges arose that required more direct intervention than the archive could provide. The final collapse came not through war or internal strife, but through a gradual loss of purpose and direction as the people forgot the principles that had made their civilization great. Without Seraphin's direct presence to inspire and guide them, her successors became increasingly corrupt and incompetent, until the empire finally fragmented into a collection of small kingdoms that warred endlessly among themselves. The archive itself was lost during the chaos of the final collapse, buried beneath the ruins of Valdris Major when earthquakes and floods destroyed the great capital. For 2,000 years, it lay hidden beneath tons of stone and earth, its crystalline structures slowly accumulating the psychic energy of human thought, in motion from the civilizations that rose and fell above it. And there it might have remained forever, if not for the curiosity of modern archaeologists who began excavating the ruins of the ancient city 50 years ago. They discovered chambers filled with artifacts and artworks of incredible beauty and sophistication, evidence of a civilization far more advanced than historians had believed possible for that era. But it was only last month that they broke through into the deepest chambers, where the Archive of Ages had waited in silence for 2 millennia. The crystalline structures were still intact, still glowing with a soft light that indicated the presence of stored consciousness and memory. And when the lead archaeologist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, placed her hand on the central crystal, she made contact with a voice that had been waiting patiently for someone to hear its message. "Welcome," said the voice of Empress Seraphina, speaking across the centuries with perfect clarity. "I have been waiting for you to find me. There is so much I need to tell you about the true history of your world, and the choices your civilization will soon need to make." Music fades to a whisper, then stops completely. That archaeologist was my grandmother, and the message she received that day changed everything our family believed about history, consciousness, and the nature of human potential. The archive is still there, still waiting, still preserving the wisdom of a civilization that achieved greatness by choosing to transcend limitations of individual mortality But I am not telling you this story as a historian or an archaeologist. I am telling you this because I am the current keeper of the archive, the one chosen to carry forward Seraphine's legacy into the modern world. My name is Dr. Elena Mitchell, and I am the granddaughter of the woman who first made contact with the consciousness preserved within those ancient crystals. For the past 20 years, I have served as the conduit between our world and the wisdom of the Valdrian Empire. Through me, Seraphine's voice continues to speak, offering guidance and knowledge to those who seek to understand the true potential of human civilization. But more than that, I have become the guardian of a secret that could reshape our understanding of consciousness, mortality, and the choices that define us as a species. The archive showed me visions of possible futures for our own civilization, some bright with promise, others dark with the shadows of our potential failures. I have seen timelines where humanity transcends its physical limitations through technology and wisdom, becoming something greater than we can currently imagine. But I have also seen futures where we destroy ourselves through ignorance and greed, leaving behind only ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The choice, as it always has been, remains ours to make. The Crimson Crown may be gone, crumbled to dust a millennia ago, but the power it represented, the ability to transcend individual mortality through collective wisdom and shared consciousness, available to any civilization advanced enough to understand its true nature. Seraphine's story is not just ancient history, it is a prophecy, a warning, and an invitation all rolled into one. She chose to sacrifice her individual existence to preserve something greater, creating a legacy that could guide future generations toward enlightenment. Her empire fell, as all empires must, but her wisdom survived, waiting patiently for the right moment to emerge and offer its gifts to a world ready to receive them. That moment, I believe, is now. We stand at the threshold of an age where the barriers between individual consciousness and collective knowledge are beginning to dissolve. Through our technology, our global communications, our growing understanding of the connections that bind all life together, we are becoming something that Seraphina would recognize as species, ready to transcend the limitations that have defined us throughout history. But transcendence is not automatic. It requires choices, sacrifices, and the wisdom to understand that true immortality lies not in preserving our individual self, but in creating something larger and more enduring than any single life could ever be. The archive still waits beneath the ruins of Valdris Major, its crystalline structures glowing with the accumulated wisdom of ages. Seraphine's consciousness still speaks to those who have the courage to listen, offering guidance to any who seek to build a civilization worthy of the name. The choice to seek her out, to learn from her example, and to apply her wisdom to our own challenges remains open to anyone bold enough to make it. But remember, as you consider whether to seek out this ancient wisdom, that some knowledge comes with a price. To truly understand Seraphine's story is to accept responsibility for acting upon that understanding. To hear her voice is to become part of her eternal mission to guide consciousness toward its highest potential. And to touch the archive is to risk being transformed by the experience as my grandmother was, as I have been, as you might be if you choose to follow the path that leads to the ruins of that ancient city. The story of the Crimson Crown of Valdris is more than legend. It is an invitation to transcendence, a map to transformation, and a challenge to every soul brave enough to dream of immortality, not through the preservation of the self, but through the creation of something eternal and beautiful that will outlast all the empires of the world. The choice, as always, is yours to make. But know that once you begin walking the path toward the archive, there can be no turning back. The whispers of ancient wisdom have a way of changing those who hear them, and Seraphine's voice, once heard, can never be forgotten. She waits still, patient as stone, eternal as the stars, ready to share her secrets with any soul brave enough or desperate enough to seek them out. But perhaps that is a story for another time, when the world is ready to hear what the Empress of Ages has to say about the future. We are even now creating with every choice we make, every word we speak, and every dream we dare to dream of immortality.